A quiet garden, a buried secret, and a death that never quite made sense. Beneath the soft soil of a noble estate, something darker has festered, silent for years, waiting to be uncovered. What begins with a whisper in the roots soon unravels into a tale of deception, forgotten loyalties, and a truth no one wished to exhume. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was during a particularly languid August that I found myself once again ensconced in our shared rooms at Baker Street, surrounded by the familiar scent of pipe smoke and the scattered remains of monographs on poisons, footprints, and obscure dialects of Eastern Europe. London sweltered under a dull, stifling haze, and not even a petty theft nor a matrimonial scandal had made its way across our threshold for nearly a fortnight. Holmes, ever a creature of stimulation, lay sprawled in his armchair like some great hawk at rest, fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes half-lidded but ceaseless in calculation. I had seen this stillness before. It was not repose, but a tightening of springs that, given time, would demand release. "We are surrounded by idleness, Watson," he muttered without opening his eyes. "The city sleeps, and with it, so do its vices." I ventured no reply. Even the murmur of the street below seemed reluctant to disturb him. To stir him, I reached for the morning paper and began reading aloud. A burglary in Mayfair elicited only a grunt. A case of mistaken identity in Southwark drew a slight raising of an eyebrow. But when I reached a minor column buried among the advertisements, concerning a commotion at a country estate in Hampshire, Holmes opened his eyes fully for the first time that morning. "Go on," he said, with the faintest flicker of interest. "An estate? Which one? And what sort of commotion?" I obliged, unaware then that the words I read would be the first thread of a most curious tapestry. That evening, as fog curled along the eaves and the gaslights painted yellow halos in the mist, a knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Hudson showed in a man of middle years, tall but stooped, his boots caked with dried mud, and his jacket of coarse canvas stained with something dark about the sleeves. He doffed a battered cap as he entered, revealing a sharply healed scar that ran just above his right brow, though he made no effort to hide it. "Mr. Holmes, sir," he began. "I've come up from Hampshire. Name's Gideon Blake. I'm the head gardener at Moorcroft Hall." His voice wavered between deference and something watchful, almost predatory. Holmes motioned for him to sit without a word, his eyes already moving from the calluses, or lack thereof, on the man's fingers to the faint indentation where a ring had once rested. "Hampshire, you say?" Holmes murmured. "And the soil there, does it cling like London clay or fall loose like chalk?" Blake hesitated. It was not long before Holmes leaned back with a soft exhalation, his expression unreadable. "Curious," he said, almost to himself. "Your hands are smooth, save for one blister on the thumb, and yet you claim to dig daily. Your boots are muddy, but the sole's untouched, as though applied rather than earned." Blake flushed slightly but said nothing. "And that accent, Hampshire lilt over a boarding school foundation. You are a gardener, Mr. Blake, as I am the Queen of Sheba." I caught my breath, but Blake merely lowered his gaze. "I thought it better not to arrive under my real name." Holmes rose and moved to the fireplace, poking at the coals with his usual irritation reserved for dull flames and duller lies. "Well then, let us set aside fiction for the evening," he said, turning. "You have come not about gardening, but about something long buried and newly unearthed." Blake gave a single, slow nod. "There are roots one should never disturb, Mr. Holmes," he said softly. Holmes offered him tea with a cordiality that belied his sharpened interest. "And yet someone has disturbed them, haven't they? Begin at the beginning, sir. I dare say we shall find your truth among the worms." As Blake settled more comfortably into the chair, Holmes posed a casual question regarding his employer. "And how is Sir Percival these days?" he asked, his tone light, almost distracted. Blake responded without hesitation. "Percival's not the sort to show what's on his mind." There was the faintest pause after the word, but it was enough. Holmes' fingers twitched ever so slightly on the armrest, and I knew that a fuse had been lit in that ever-active mind of his. No true servant would omit the honorific in such a manner, let alone speak of an aristocrat with such intimacy. Blake, it seemed, was either very careless or very confident, or perhaps both. Holmes made no remark in the moment, only nodded slowly, but I caught the gleam behind his half-lidded eyes. He had already begun to tear at the fabric of the man's story, and it would not hold for long. "I had been clearing the Old North plot," Blake began, shifting forward in his seat. "They're replacing the greenhouse walls and needed the roots removed. The tree there, an old elm, had long since died, but the ground beneath it was still thick with root." His voice was steady now, rehearsed. "I struck something with the blade. Not stone, metal. About 2 feet down." Holmes remained still. "It was a box," Blake continued. "Rusted, locked, maybe 6 inches wide. I didn't open it, thought I'd best report it. But then I hesitated." His fingers tapped against his trousers. "I took it instead to the tool shed and locked it up for the night. Something about it unsettled me, as though it weren't meant to be found." He paused here. Holmes finally spoke. "And what happened that night, Mr. Blake?" Blake's gaze sharpened. "Someone came for it. I heard the shed door wrench, someone trying to force the lock. But they must have been spooked because by morning it was broken but still shut." A faint tremble touched his voice. "That was when I came to you." Blake recounted the following morning with a sort of guarded tension, as though recounting a dream he wished had not occurred. "The lock was twisted half off its bolt," he said, as though someone had used a pry bar or heavy boot, but the box was still there, untouched. He paused. "At least I thought so." He glanced towards at Holmes, but found only silence. Watson-style curiosity compelled me to ask, were there any footprints or signs someone had entered? "There was mud, plenty of it," Blake replied, "but with the recent rains and all the foot traffic near the shed, it was hopeless to trace." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Yet they came prepared to retrieve it. That tells me the box was known, not stumbled upon. Tell me, Mr. Blake, did you inform anyone of what you'd found before that night?" Blake hesitated, and that hesitation said enough. Holmes rose and drifted toward the fireplace, ostensibly warming his fingers, but I knew that his eyes never truly left our guest. When he turned back, his gaze fell upon Blake's hands. "Forgive me," Holmes said lightly, "but I make a habit of noting hands before words, and yours, sir, are a puzzle." Blake blinked. "My hands?" "Yes, the palms, smooth, nails, polished, if recently trimmed, but there's a single blister on the right thumb, precisely where one might form it from an afternoon's trial at digging, but not the hardened calluses of a man long accustomed to such labour." Blake said nothing. Holmes tilted his head. "And then there is the matter of your left index finger. No earth beneath the nail, despite your tale of battling with root systems." Blake shifted. "I wore gloves." "Of course, but gloves would not produce such a blister, nor would they explain the faint ink stain just beneath your cuticle. One earns that behind a ledger, not a wheelbarrow." I watched as the blood rose faintly to Blake's face. Holmes had begun to uproot the fiction with delicate precision. It was when Blake became more agitated that the final clue slipped through. His tongue. "I only wanted to keep it safe, you see," he said, the words sharper now, tinged with a clipped northern edge. Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Fascinating," he said, almost cheerfully. "You've kept your vowels neatly pressed until just now. That last sentence. Lancashire, I believe. An accent trained out by boarding school, but still lurking beneath the polish." Blake's lips parted, but no protest emerged. "And yet you claim to be born and raised in the South. A man may fake many things, Mr. Blake, but not his mother's voice. The silence was sudden and heavy. I caught myself glancing toward the window, as though expecting the fog outside to press its ear to the glass. Holmes, meanwhile, sat back with a look of mild satisfaction. "I think it is time, Mr. Blake," Holmes said quietly, "that you tell us not what you wish us to believe, but what actually brought you here." Blake's expression hardened. For a moment, I thought he might rise and leave without a word, but then his shoulders dropped, the weight of secrecy too heavy to bear. "Very well," he murmured, "but you must understand. I didn't come to cause trouble. I came to end it." Holmes said nothing, merely nodded once. "The truth is, I'm not a gardener," Blake admitted. "Never was. The name is real enough, but the profession isn't. I went there under false pretenses to find something my family lost years ago." "Not something," Holmes corrected. "Someone, or some claim." Blake met his gaze. "The box holds proof of a change to a will. My father was Sir Percival's elder brother, cut off, disowned, and now gone. But before he died, he left something behind. My mother hid it. Then she vanished too. And now," Holmes said slowly, "you believe what lies in that box could restore what was stolen." Blake nodded. "Or expose who buried it." When Blake finally departed, the evening had deepened into a thicker gloom, the lamplight casting long, restless shadows along the walls of Baker Street. Holmes stood by the window, pipe in hand, watching the figure recede into the mist. "A curious man," I said at last. "A man driven by blood and silence," Holmes replied. "Two potent forces in matters of inheritance." I turned to him. "Do you believe him?" "I believe him enough," Holmes said dryly. "At least in part, he plays the gardener poorly, but the desperate man with some finesse." He tapped his pipe twice against the windowsill. "We have not met a gardener, Watson, only a man playing at planting. And if I am not mistaken, he is not the only one who has sown something at Moorcroft Hall." There was a beat of stillness. "I think," he added, with a faint gleam in his eye, "it is time we took a turn in the country." It was 2 mornings after Blake's visit that Holmes declared the matter sufficiently ripe for direct observation. By evening, we were bound by rail to Hampshire, he with a folded newspaper and I with my notebook, both of us travelling under the false names of Mr. Garland and Dr. Plumley. Aliases Holmes seemed to conjure with as much ease as his morning tea. The countryside welcomed us with hedgerows, the tang of hay, and a stillness that always made me feel rather out of place in my city boots. "We are not here to disturb the surface, Watson," Holmes murmured, as we disembarked at a sleepy rural station, "but to feel what lies beneath it." Moorcroft Hall was a stately thing, but somehow weary in posture, ivy clutching at stone, and the windows bearing that hollow gleam peculiar to houses with too many secrets. Holmes had already written ahead to the estate under his historian's guise, citing a project on ancestral gardens and Georgian-era land use. An invitation had promptly arrived. "We must tread with the gentleness of scholars," Holmes said, adjusting his cravat, "but observe with the hunger of hawks." Sir Percival received us in a drawing-room that smelt faintly of lavender and long-dried ink. His handshake was perfunctory, his eyes sharp, though lined by age, and something I took for habitual caution. He appeared mildly amused by our claimed purpose, and even insisted on tea, which we accepted. Holmes launched into a genial lecture on Saxon boundary hedges, while I, the supposed botanist, commented admiringly on the soil composition near the southern garden wall, which I had not seen. "I've always said the house was more root than roof," Sir Percival said, a remark I found oddly chosen. Holmes made no response save for a slight smile. During the meal, I noted several glances exchanged between the butler and a younger woman seated near the French doors, a companion or niece, perhaps. There was an air of constraint beneath the genteel surface, a hesitation in answers, and a faint tremor in the spoon when the girl stirred her tea. As we were shown the old garden paths afterward, Holmes murmured, Observe, Watson. Every plant here knows where it stands. The same cannot be said for the people. It was from a scullery maid, coaxed by Holmes's fabricated inquiry into family folklores of country houses, that the name first emerged, Mary Truelove. The girl said it quickly, as though spitting out something that had been caught in her throat for years. Who was she? I asked. She was a maid, sir, came the whispered reply. Long before my time. Vanished. Just gone one morning. No note. No goodbyes. Some say she ran. Some say... She stopped herself. Holmes nodded gently, encouraging her. Some say she was found out, the girl finished. But by whom or for what, no one ever said. They stopped talking about her altogether. Holmes grew thoughtful. Silence is often louder than suspicion, he murmured. Later, I queried Holmes privately. You believe this Mary was connected to Blake? I do, he replied. More than that, I believe she did not vanish of her own accord. And Sir Percival? Holmes's eyes narrowed. He knows something. His eyes flinched at her name, though he said nothing. We are not at the roots yet, Watson, but I believe we are digging in the right patch of earth. It was at luncheon, as Holmes complimented the age of the Moorcroft silver, that he casually introduced the subject of family lineage. Sir Percival answered with tight economy, listing a string of surnames, baronets, and military men. When Holmes inquired if the estate had always passed cleanly from father to son, our host's spoon paused mid-air. There was my brother, Lawrence, he said after a moment, his tone clipped. He died abroad. Ah, said Holmes gently. A pity. Older or younger? Older, said Percival, eyes now fixed on his tea, but unfit. He relinquished all claims of his own accord. Quite, Holmes said, not pressing. Later, as we walked to the South Orchard, Holmes turned to me. The brother who left no shadow, Watson, disinherited, declared unfit, and then, conveniently, dead abroad. Yet not a photograph, not a painting, not a scrap bearing his name hangs in the entire house. You believe he was erased? I believe, Holmes said calmly, that the brother did not leave this place willingly, and someone made sure no one asked where he had gone. We requested to see the contents Blake had hidden, which Holmes arranged discreetly through a local intermediary. The box arrived wrapped in rough cloth, its rust now flaking across my gloves as I held it. Holmes examined it with delicate attention, running his fingers over the hinges and the lock. Curious, he murmured. The corrosion here is genuine, but these scratches are fresh. And the hinge, note the filing along the edge. This box has been opened recently, and clumsily. He took a fine lens from his breast pocket and peered at the rim. Watson, observe the smudge along the inner lid. Wax residue. A seal once existed here. It has been broken and not replaced. The contents, a few brittle documents and a tarnished brooch, appeared unremarkable. Holmes set them aside and peered deeper. Do you not find it peculiar, he said, that a man risks breaking into a tool shed not to take what's inside, but to replace it? You mean the box was swapped? No, Watson. Worse. The box is the same, but the truth it once held has been replaced with lies. It was through the intervention of the housekeeper, a severe woman with little love for questions, that Holmes managed to corner the oldest groundsman on the estate. The man, Mr. Rudge, bore a face as lined as an autumn leaf, and eyes that blinked too often when asked about the past. Gardeners seen plenty come and go, he muttered when Holmes inquired about changes in staff. And any who left under unusual circumstances? There was a pause, a long one. Might have been one, Rudge said at last. Before my time proper, but folks whispered. Fellow named Ellis. Dug in the wrong place, they said. What place? Rudge scratched his chin. Back wall near the old greenhouse. Said he found something, or almost did, Next day, he were gone. Fired? Disappeared, dismissed without word, never heard of again. Holmes leaned closer. Did anyone speak of it? Rudge looked away. Not after the master told us it was to be forgotten. We left the man at his bench, Holmes thoughtful. There is a second gardener in this story, Watson, he said quietly. One who dug too deep, and was buried for it, in more ways than one. The greenhouse sat at the rear of the estate, a structure of warped glass and brick-footed beds. Holmes asked for a solitary inspection under the pretext of botanical interest. I watched as he moved among the planters, occasionally dropping to one knee, his gaze sweeping the floor with predator-like precision. There, he said at last, pointing to a faint fog of condensation pooling unevenly across the flagstones. To what do you refer? I asked. The earth exhales, Watson. Moisture rises not evenly, but from a vein beneath. The stone there is warmer. He crouched and pressed a finger to the joint between two slabs. This tile has been disturbed and reset, poorly. And your conclusion? There's a passage beneath it, he said with certainty. A tunnel, perhaps from older times. If someone wished to hide something, or retrieve it unseen, this would be the place. I looked about, unease prickling my neck. And what lies at the end of that tunnel? Holmes rose, brushing dust from his trousers. If I am correct, Watson, buried truth, a mother's vanishing, and a brother who never left at all. It was on our third evening at Moorcroft Hall, as we returned from a walk along the disused orchard wall, that Holmes fell into a state I had come to recognise as perilously close to revelation. He did not speak until we had reached the privacy of our rented lodging at the village inn, and even then, only after 3 full minutes of pipe-smoking silence. Watson, he said, Gideon Blake is not who he claims to be. That much is now beyond doubt. Then who is he? I asked. A man caught between fiction and inheritance, Holmes replied. And the mask he wears, that of a humble gardener, is beginning to crack at the edges. He rose and walked to the window. I have observed him when he thought himself unwatched. His bearing, Watson, the way he handles correspondence, how he addressed the butler without deference, how the stable boy offered him a handshake rather than a bow. There is familiarity in his presence that cannot be acquired from trimming hedges. And what do you infer? That he has trodden these halls before, Holmes said, but not as servant, as blood. The words hung in the room with the weight of unspoken lineage. I felt the case deepen then, not just in crime, but in kinship. Over the following day, Holmes grew uncharacteristically conversational with Blake, drawing him out under the pretext of needing assistance cataloguing the garden's plant varieties for his fictitious historical monograph. It was during these exchanges that the first cracks in Blake's story widened. Tell me, Holmes asked casually while examining a row of wilted lupins, did you ever visit Moorcroft as a child? Blake looked startled, then forced a laugh. Hardly. My family never moved in such circles. Yet you knew the location of the stables before they were shown to you, and corrected the butler on the pronunciation of Lady Eleanor's name. Remarkable knowledge for one unacquainted with the place. Blake fell silent. You used the term South Wing Corridor, a phrase used only by residents. Guests call it the Long Hall. Still, Blake said nothing. Holmes stepped closer. You are no ordinary impostor, Mr. Blake. You are a man with a stake. Personal, emotional, and I dare say, legal. You are the son of Lawrence Moorcroft. Blake's eyes met Holmes'. There was a beat of defiance, then surrender. My mother never meant for it to be this way, he said quietly. She was the maid, Holmes replied. He nodded. Mary Truelove. She loved my father, was loved in return. But when the will was altered to include us, things changed. Holmes placed a hand on his shoulder, not warmly, but firmly. and someone ensured it would not be found, until now. That night, Holmes unfolded the sequence for me. As we sat in the lamplit parlour of our inn, the glow from the hearth illuminated his features in chiaroscuro, his mind, as ever, already several steps ahead. Mary Truelove was no mere servant, he began. She was a linchpin in a quiet scandal, a woman who bore Lawrence Moorcroft's child and was to be legitimised through a revision of the will. But the revised document never surfaced. Instead, she vanished. I leaned forward. You believe she was removed? Holmes nodded. Silence, more likely. A woman of no family, no station, easy to discredit, easier to erase. And the gardener, the one Rudge mentioned? An unfortunate who either found the truth or came too close to it, Holmes replied. When one digs without invitation in a house such as this, one often finds more than worms. And the lockbox? Was hers, he said. Hidden by her, perhaps entrusted to someone. It contained the revised will, or a letter referring to it. Whatever proof there was, it threatened Sir Percival's claim. I sat back, struck by the symmetry of it. A vanished woman, a buried document, and a son raised in obscurity, returning not for vengeance, but for what was rightfully his. Gideon Blake came not to accuse, Holmes concluded. He came to inherit, and someone wishes him gone before that inheritance becomes legal fact. If Holmes held any suspicion before, it hardened with the arrival of a visitor to Moorcroft the following afternoon. A man named Ellis Corbin, solicitor to Sir Percival, and as it turned out, the executor of the late Lawrence Moorcroft's original will. I had thought him retired, Holmes noted, watching from a side corridor, as the man stepped from his carriage. But it seems old foxes stir when henhouses grow restless. Corbin bore the manner of a man long practised in concealment, polite to a fault, with parchment hands, and a gaze that rarely held still. Holmes made a point of being introduced under his assumed identity, and I noticed the flicker in Corbin's eyes when Holmes mentioned a recent interest in old inheritance records. That man, Holmes said to me later, knows precisely what was in that will and where it went. You believe him responsible for its disappearance? Undoubtedly, Holmes replied. Sir Percival may have had motive, but Corbin had method. He is the craftsman behind the deception, the forger, the barrier, the editor of fate. And the attempted break-in? I suspect he hired someone. He's too refined to dirty his hands. Then what's his endgame? To remove Blake, Holmes said flatly, quietly, legally, or otherwise. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. I should have grown suspicious when Holmes began speaking of moss. We had returned to our lodgings in the village when he remarked, quite out of the blue, I believe there may be a particularly rare variety of Hypnum cupressiforme growing in the western corner of the Moorcroft orchard. It thrives in shaded soil and has a peculiar tendency to cling to disused stonework. I glanced up from my notes. You intend to collect moss now? He smiled faintly. I intend nothing of the sort, my dear Watson. You, however, shall make a point of it. I stared at him. You're sending me off to pick moss while you continue hunting for a murderer? Holmes did not answer directly. Ask the groundskeeper for access. Make sure the solicitor sees you do it. Inquire about the old boundaries. Discuss erosion. Be dreadfully enthusiastic. And take your time. And while I'm communing with nature, I asked dryly, I shall be elsewhere, he said, lighting his pipe, unencumbered by any observer who might associate my movements with yours. He placed a sealed envelope into my hand. Should anything happen, give this to Inspector Langley at the Hampshire Constabulary. I frowned. Holmes, is this merely a botanical detour or something far darker? He leaned back, exhaled a long ribbon of smoke, and said with chilling clarity, This is a test, Watson, not of moss, but of men. While I wandered the orchard path muttering Latin plant names to myself like a man under enchantment, Holmes, as I later learned, had spent his time trailing Ellis Corbin. The solicitor had remained unbothered by my eccentric foraging, and it was precisely this false sense of calm Holmes had hoped to preserve. He later recounted how he followed Corbin to a small post office 2 villages away, where the man mailed a peculiar bundle wrapped in oilskin and bound with black thread, a most curious choice for correspondence. Holmes obtained access to the records by means he did not divulge, but the result was a single entry in the ledger, a letter addressed to a Mr. F. Caldwell at a lodging house near the London docks. The name meant nothing at first glance, but Holmes had once encountered it as an alias for a known intermediary in discreet, often criminal, transactions. "What do you suppose it contained?" I asked. "A copy of something now missing," Holmes replied, "or instructions to ensure someone else goes missing." "And you're sure he knows about Blake?" Holmes' expression was grim. "Corbin is not merely aware of Blake, he is preparing to erase him." That evening I found Holmes standing at the threshold of our room, hands clasped behind his back, his brow furrowed not with doubt, but with grim certainty. "It has accelerated," he said simply. "The players are moving faster than I anticipated." "In what sense?" "There is a letter in the wind and a blade in the dark," he replied. "Corbin's correspondence suggests action is imminent. Whether legal or lethal, I do not yet know." "And Blake?" "He is a threat to everything Moorcroft currently owns," Holmes said. "And men like Corbin do not risk the law when silence can be bought cheaper than litigation." He moved to the window and stared out into the dusk. "We are no longer merely untangling an old injustice, Watson. We are preventing a new one." I felt a weight settle in my chest. "Then what is our next move?" Holmes did not turn. "We spring a trap," he said quietly, "and we do it with the oldest tools known to man." I tilted my head. "Courage." Holmes allowed a ghost of a smile. "Temptation." It was on the 4th evening of our stay that Holmes finally unveiled the plan in full. A trap, delicate in construction, yet deviously simple in concept. A second box, he said, would be discovered beneath the composting trough behind the potting shed. Word of this would reach the right ears, and those ears, Holmes believed, would not sleep peacefully knowing such an artifact remained unfetched. "How will the bait be known?" I asked. "It won't need to be," Holmes replied. "The gardener will mention it to the butler will pass it to the solicitor, and by dawn it will have reached the man who thinks in shadows. You shall inform Blake that something new has been found. Another box, one said to contain letters bearing the seal of Lawrence Moorcroft. Let him spread the whisper." "And the contents?" I asked. "Utter fiction," he said with satisfaction. "An envelope filled with gardening receipts, a crumpled photograph of an unremarkable woman, and a forged note suggesting a claim to the estate." That morning, the box was planted beneath the loose plank in the shed floor. By nightfall, Holmes paced with serene expectation. "It's no longer about truth," he said. "Now it is about panic." "And what if no one comes?" I ventured. "Then we wait longer. But they will come, Watson. Greed always hears footsteps when it suspects truth has taken a shovel." We waited that night in the stillness that only old gardens seem to possess, where every creak feels conspiratorial, every rustle a whisper. Holmes and I took our post beside the broken trellis behind the shed, obscured by a row of overgrown laurels. Blake had been dismissed from the grounds for the evening on Holmes's instruction, under the pretense of safety. The air was thick with anticipation. Holmes remained preternaturally calm, while I confess, could feel each passing minute strain against my chest like a drawn string. Even the moon appeared reluctant, half veiled in mist, casting an ashen light across the tool shed's timbers. At one point, I fancied I heard a crunch of leaves, but Holmes only placed a finger to his lips and offered no movement. Then came a soft click, the shed's outer latch, not the brash force of a thief, but the cautious, calculated silence of a man who believes he is alone. A few more seconds, and the creak of a hinge followed. Holmes touched my shoulder lightly. "Now we watch," he breathed. "And when do we act?" I whispered. "When he makes the mistake," he replied. They always do, Watson. The guilty never simply retrieve. They search. There was a quiet rustle of fabric, the faint scuff of boots on wood, and then a strange moment of pause. Some inner debate, perhaps, before the figure stepped fully into view. Holmes stiffened beside me, and I followed his gaze. It was not Corbin. The man inside the shed bore a striking figure, tall, cloaked, and moving with an odd combination of certainty and concealment, but the lantern he held cast an upward light upon his face, and what I saw banished all uncertainty. The man wore the weathered coat of Lawrence Moorcroft, complete with a frayed lapel and tarnished brass buttons. I'd glimpsed once before in a family portrait hidden behind a curtain in the drawing room. "Sir Percival," Holmes murmured beside me. The revelation struck like a chill through the spine. Sir Percival himself had come, not with solicitor nor servant, but in the borrowed garb of his dead brother, a disguise not to fool others, but perhaps to shield his own conscience. He moved toward the false box, bending to inspect it. His fingers trembled. Holmes rose then, calmly, deliberately. "Looking for something, Sir Percival?" he called. The baronet turned sharply, and for a fleeting second the mask of dignity fell away. He was a man cornered, not in position, but in spirit. "I suggest you do not run," Holmes added, stepping forward. "The constable is waiting beyond the hedge." The older man did not run. He stood straighter, closed the box, and said coldly, "You should not meddle in family matters, Mr. Holmes." "To the contrary," Holmes said, "it is precisely where meddling most often reveals murder." What followed was not some heroic scuffle nor clean arrest, but rather a sordid tangle of panic and pride. Sir Percival, in a final attempt to retrieve the box, lunged, not at Holmes, but toward the rear wall of the shed, where a rusted rake hung like a last recourse. Holmes stepped in an instant sooner, knocking it down with a kick and placing himself between Percival and the tool. "You have nothing left to bury," he said, voice calm but steeled. "The truth is already above ground." For a moment, I believed the matter would end there, but then came the crack of snapping twig and the hurried approach of Boots, Constable Hargreaves, arriving from the orchard path with breathless urgency. The sound startled Percival into motion. He shoved Holmes aside with more strength than I would have credited the man, and made for the door. I blocked his path, out of instinct more than plan, and received a blow to the shoulder for my trouble. But Holmes was already behind him, grasping his coat and pulling him backward with surgical precision. Together, we managed to wrestle him down, the constable arriving just in time to apply irons. Percival collapsed to one knee, breathing heavily, the mask of the estate owner now entirely gone. "You don't understand," he spat. "Everything was mine. It was meant to be mine." "It was never yours," Holmes replied. "It was his. You merely held it hostage." We watched in silence as Hargreaves led him away into the darkness, the box left behind on the workbench, untouched and meaningless. Holmes did not look at it. "What now?" I asked. "Now," Holmes said, brushing dust from his sleeve. "Now we return to London. I believe our work in the garden is complete." "But the real will?" I asked. "Do you believe it still exists?" Holmes gave the faintest smile. "Oh, it exists, Watson, and I believe we already have it, just not where anyone expected to find it." It was not until the following morning, as we took our tea in the modest parlour of the village inn, that Holmes casually revealed the true resolution of the case had already been set in motion long before Sir Percival set foot in the potting shed. "I must confess," he said, stirring his tea without interest in the cup, "that our friend Blake need not worry over the false box, nor, for that matter, over the forged note within it." I glanced up. "You mean to say the real documents were never in danger?" "Not for the last 3 days," Holmes replied. "You recall my brief visit to the estate library on our second morning?" I did recall it. Holmes had excused himself with the flimsy justification of checking the tax records for evidence of greenhouse renovations. I had reason to believe that Miss Truelove, being a woman of limited options but considerable cleverness, would have hidden the will in a place both familiar and ignored. I searched the floorboards beneath the tall case clock, an area prone to dry rot, yet peculiarly undisturbed, and there it was. He withdrew a folded parchment from his coat. Witnessed, dated, legally sound. I leaned forward, stunned. Then the estate will pass to Blake? Provided the courts agree, Holmes said, which they shall. The seal is intact, and the signature is genuine. And Percival, I asked. Holmes sipped his tea. Shall face trial for fraud, obstruction, and perhaps more. But his greater sentence lies in what he has lost. We sat quietly for some time after, digesting not just the facts, but the peculiar turn of character that had brought Sir Percival to his own undoing. I must admit, Holmes said at last, that I had fully expected Ellis Corbin to be our intruder. All signs pointed to him, the forged documents, the clumsy swap, the hired eyes near the train station. Yet it was Percival himself, I said, shaking my head. Indeed, Holmes replied. A man of wealth and breeding, reduced to creeping through his own potting shed in his dead brother's coat. There was a wry twist to his mouth. Even I, Watson, occasionally misjudged the proportion of pride in a man. I believed he would delegate. I miscalculated. I raised an eyebrow. You admit an error? Only in the detail, he said smoothly. My conclusions remain intact. But Percival chose to act directly. Not from courage, but from vanity. He could not bear that someone else might mishandle the task of reclaiming what he viewed as his birthright. He leaned back, looking out the window. There is something tragically operatic about it, he mused. A man who might have hidden behind his solicitor, his title, his lineage, yet instead chose a mask stitched from shame and ambition. And in doing so, unmasked himself completely, I added. Holmes smiled faintly. Precisely. He struck a match, lit his pipe, and exhaled slowly. Even I cannot always predict vanity, Watson. It is the one emotion that mimics both bravery and foolishness, often within the same breath. It was not until the following afternoon, just before our departure, that Holmes spoke again of the original gardener, the one dismissed in silence, buried in rumour. His name was Ellis, not the solicitor, but the man Rudge mentioned, Ellis Morton. I made inquiries, Holmes said. He had worked at Moorcroft for 7 years before he was abruptly released. Why? I asked. Because he saw something he was not meant to, Holmes replied. I believe he stumbled upon Miss Truelove's hiding place, or perhaps saw her attempting to retrieve something after Lawrence's death. And what became of him? Found drowned in the pond near the orchard wall, Holmes said quietly. Ruled an accident, no autopsy, no family, and no questions asked. We were silent for a time. Then Holmes added, he too dug too deep, and he paid the price. I looked out toward the fields beyond the inn, golden in the afternoon sun. Then Blake is not the first to search beneath Moorcroft's soil. Holmes nodded. No, but perhaps he is the first to survive what he found. It was with a curious mixture of relief and exhaustion that I once more found myself climbing the familiar steps of 220B Baker Street. The scent of dusted carpets and old tobacco welcomed us like an old friend. And I dare say Holmes, though never sentimental, allowed himself a brief moment of comfort in reacquainting with his violin and his disordered chemistry corner. Mrs. Hudson brought in tea with her customary silence, though her glances spoke volumes. Holmes, after a cursory nod of thanks, removed his overcoat, lit a match with particular deliberation, and seated himself in his favourite chair. Now, Watson, he said, crossing one leg over the other, I believe it is time to lift the final veil. I've been waiting, I confessed. Though I must say, you've kept this curtain drawn unusually long. He smiled faintly. The performance required an intermission, but the act resumes. Holmes leaned forward. There were, in truth, 3 keys to this mystery, he began. The will that vanished, the woman dismissed, and the gardener buried too quietly. Each alone was curious. Together, conspiratorial. You believe them connected, intimately, as root to leaf. But let us take them in order. The revised will, Watson, never left the house, not at first. I stirred. Then it was hidden? Not by Lawrence, Holmes replied. By someone else. Someone whose loyalty ran deeper than blood. The woman in question, Holmes continued, was Mrs. Margaret Blake, our young client's mother. You will recall that she was removed from the estate staff under vague pretenses some years before Lawrence's untimely demise. I recall Blake mentioning it, I said. She was dismissed when he was still at school. Precisely, said Holmes. But what he did not know, what no one but Lawrence likely knew, is that she was entrusted with something quite significant, namely, the newly revised will. I stared at him. She had it all along? For a time, Holmes nodded. I believe Lawrence, knowing his health to be fragile, confided in her and placed the document in her safekeeping. Perhaps he sensed Percival's ambition, or perhaps it was mere caution. Either way, Margaret Blake removed the will from any place Percival might search and concealed it herself. And then she vanished, I murmured. Conveniently, yes, Holmes said, but not mysteriously. Percival saw to it that her employment was terminated and likely offered a sum for silence. Whether she accepted or fled out of prudence, I cannot say, but her departure removed the will from circulation. And yet it returned. Holmes gestured toward the small box upon the mantelpiece. She hid it in the one place she still knew would be undisturbed, the floorboards beneath the library clock. I believe she confided in Miss Truelove, who later tried to retrieve it. I exhaled slowly, all to protect her son. Indeed, Holmes said softly, and in doing so, she planted the first seed of the truth that would later bloom into exposure. Now, Holmes said, steepling his fingers beneath his chin, to the man who gave this tale its title and its warning. You mean Ellis Morton, I said. The gardener. Holmes nodded. The gardener who quite literally dug too deep. He paused before continuing. I obtained a statement, buried in the archives of the local constabulary, filed by Morton 3 weeks before his death. It was phrased with caution, but clear enough for those who care to read. He had seen a woman, most likely Miss Truelove, tampering with the boards near the library clock. He had heard snippets of conversation between Lawrence and his mother about matters that did not concern flowers or estate accounts. I frowned. And then he drowned. Yes, Holmes said darkly, in a pond 3 feet deep, with no witnesses and no inquest. The coroner ruled it a slip, as did the magistrate, but the bruising on the back of his head was noted, then dismissed. And Percival? I asked. Holmes did not reply at once. When he did, it was with measured coldness. If I were to guess, I would say Morton had approached someone he trusted, perhaps intending only to warn, but secrets like these attract more than curiosity. They attract fear. I shivered slightly, despite the fire. He died trying to do the right thing. Which, Holmes said, is why the truth needed to be told in full, even if it arrived years too late for him. There remains, Holmes said, one final piece that puzzled me. The elm tree. The one beside the greenhouse? I asked. He gave a short nod. It was out of place, Watson, planted hastily, perhaps 5 years ago, and clearly not native to that particular soil. Its root spread had damaged the foundations beneath the path, which was what drew my attention. You believed it covered something? I suspected it, Holmes replied. It was Morton's notes, preserved in an old gardening journal, that confirmed it. He recorded a hollow beneath the west elm, once used to store frost lanterns. That phrase struck me. And it was a tunnel? I asked, leaning forward. A small one, Holmes said, leading beneath the tool shed. It had once served, in the estate's older days, as a smuggler's crawl, though long forgotten. Miss Truelove used it to access the grounds undetected when retrieving the will. And Percival, I asked. Did he know of it? Holmes shook his head. That, I believe, was his undoing. He searched openly in drawers and desks, but the roots of this case, quite literally, ran deeper. He stood and walked toward the window. Truth, he said quietly, often hides in the soil, but dig with patience, and you'll find what others tried to bury. Holmes reached for a modest envelope, dog-eared and faded, from a stack beside his armchair. It is remarkable, he said, how often the past insists upon being read, especially when penned by those who believed their ink would never matter. He passed it to me. The script was feminine, careful, and bore the initials M.B. Margaret Blake? I asked. Indeed, one of a series of letters exchanged between her and Lawrence over a span of some 5 years. I obtained them through Miss Truelove, who, it seems, retained a bundle in trust. I turned the pages slowly. They were not romantic, but fiercely loyal. Letters between mother and son, discussing affairs of household management, concerns about Percival's increasing interference, and eventually references to the documents and your father's wish. Holmes continued. What is most telling, however, lies not in what they wrote, but what they assumed. Margaret Blake refers to Lawrence as the only true Moorcroft heir. I looked up. You're suggesting Percival was not? Not legitimately, Holmes replied. I obtained a copy of the late Lord Moorcroft's wedding certificate through a legal acquaintance in Cheltenham. There is no mention of a second child until 4 years later, by which point the dowager lady had been travelling alone. It appears Percival's birth was quietly acknowledged, but never legally legitimised. An affair? I asked. Holmes raised a brow. More likely a scandal patched with silence. The old lord was a shrewd man, but no saint. Percival's claim depended on a document that, if challenged, would crumble. Margaret Blake knew this. Lawrence likely did too. And so the inheritance, I murmured, was never his by right. Just so, Holmes said. Percival gambled not only on Lawrence's silence, but on his own myth. And myths, Watson, do not hold up well to paper. Holmes folded his hands with a trace of something almost like weariness. Vanity, Watson, is among the least useful sins. It blinds more men than lust or greed ever could. Yet he was clever, I said. He anticipated obstacles, managed to keep suspicion low for years. Holmes inclined his head. Clever, yes, but not imaginative. He assumed that because he could manipulate those around him, the world itself would yield to his story. He had no true conception of uncertainty. Everything he did was theatrical. He even wore Lawrence's coat, I added. Precisely. A grand flourish for an audience that never arrived. You see, Watson, his mistake was not planting evidence. It was believing he could direct perception as one would direct a play. But life, inconveniently, contains critics. And you, I smiled, were not an approving one. Holmes chuckled. I do have exacting tastes. He tapped the arm of his chair. There is a type of man, he went on, who prefers to win alone rather than share the truth with anyone. He fears exposure not because it may ruin him, but because it will show the world he was never quite the genius he imagined. I nodded. So in the end, it was pride that caught him. As it so often is, Holmes said. Had he simply let someone else retrieve the false will, we might still be speculating. He exhaled once, sharply. But even I, Watson, cannot always predict vanity. The case concluded. I had hoped young Blake might find comfort in claiming his heritage. But when we next heard from him, it was in the form of a brief telegram from Southampton. Estate sold. Passage booked. Leaving England. Thank you both. Farewell. A. Blake. I showed it to Holmes, who read it without comment, and then resumed tuning his violin. You seem unsurprised, I said. Not at all, he replied. Men raised on silence do not often build empires. They seek stiller waters. And the estate? A mausoleum of secrets. I dare say he did wisely to walk away. He paused and plucked a sharp note. Sentiment, he said, is admirable in poetry, but fatal in strategy. You're quoting yourself now, I said dryly. He smiled faintly. An unfortunate habit, but occasionally correct. I watched the bow glide over the strings. And Percival? Will live in obscurity, Holmes replied. The law will spare him prison, but not disgrace. In some ways, that is the greater punishment. Outside, the day waned, grey and unassuming. Holmes played a minor key, slow and unhurried. It sounded to my ears like the closing of a chapter neither of us would care to reopen. It was a rare morning of quietude in Baker Street. The haze of early sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, laying soft patterns upon our modest breakfast table. Holmes, as was his custom following the resolution of a particularly intricate case, had taken a vow of contemplative silence, which he observed with the strictness of a monk. I busied myself with toast and marmalade, though my appetite had yet to recover from the emotional whirlwind we had only just concluded. My companion sat opposite, one leg crossed elegantly over the other, his fingers steepled before his lips as his gaze fixed some indeterminate point above the mantel. It struck me that Holmes, though outwardly calm, was processing the affair in reverse, beginning at its violent conclusion and methodically unspooling every prior step, testing his memory against the facts as if seeking errors in a musical composition. When I cleared my throat, he did not flinch, but I sensed his awareness of me sharpen, as though I had stepped across the periphery of a diagram he was mentally redrawing. Holmes? I ventured. How many such secrets lie beneath English soil, never meant to be found? He looked at me, without shifting his position. That, my dear Watson, is precisely the problem. As I sipped my tea, I found my thoughts drifting, unwillingly, perhaps inevitably, back to the gardens of Moorcroft Hall. There was a particular spot behind the east wing where the soil had been turned recently, and though its surface now bore the harmless ruffle of spade marks filled in, I could not help but think of it as a scar, still tender to the eye. It is curious, I said aloud, more to myself than to Holmes, how the truth can lie buried for so long in plain earth. Men walk over it, children play nearby, and still it slumbers undisturbed. Until someone digs too deep. Holmes finished for me, though his tone lacked malice. As with all things in nature, Watson, it is not the burial that troubles me, but the presumption that the dead will stay quiet. I nodded slowly, the image of the gardener, honest, doomed, forgotten, rising once more in my mind's eye. How many have walked past that elm, I murmured, never realizing the tunnel beneath their feet? How many lives reshaped by secrets planted decades ago? Holmes merely gave a soft hum, but I knew we were of one mind. The past, I reflected, has long roots, and sometimes they crack through the stones we thought immovable. Holmes finally stirred, reaching with precision for the kettle. He poured his tea with the grace of a surgeon and took a long, deliberate sip before speaking. "You romanticize, Watson," he said, setting down the cup. "You see the gardener and think of tragedy. I see human nature and think of inevitability." I raised an eyebrow. "You think the man's death inevitable?" "Not the death," Holmes replied. "The concealment. Nature may bury its dead, but greed, my dear fellow, greed does the deeper digging." I could not help but smile, though it was tinged with melancholy. Holmes had, in his characteristically brutal clarity, stripped away my sentiment and revealed the grim skeleton beneath. "Perhaps," I said, "but does it not matter that someone finally uncovered it?" Holmes shrugged. "Truth is indifferent to its own discovery. Only men assign it value." And with that, he reached for the post. The letter was of good paper, thick and perfumed, Addressed in a fine Cyrillic hand, Holmes slit it open with the tip of his knife and scanned its contents in silence. He did not look up for several moments. When he did, a spark had returned to his eyes. Russian aristocracy, a stolen violin, and a disgraced maestro with debts in Vienna, he said, already rising from his seat. Another case? I asked, startled. Indeed, and this one, I suspect, may involve music worth more than melody. He disappeared into the bedroom to fetch his coat, pipe clenched between his teeth. Holmes paused at the door. You see, Watson, he said over his shoulder, even the quietest gardens can grow murderous roots. And with that singular flourish, he vanished into the morning fog, leaving behind, as always, the echo of his mind and the scent of tobacco. As we walked from the breakfast table, Holmes paused beside the window, the faint grey of morning tracing his features in silver. You see, Watson, he murmured, tamping his pipe with idle precision. Men often go to extraordinary lengths to bury the truth, but they forget. Soil settles, wood warps, and time, relentless as ever, will stir what they tried to hide. He glanced toward me, a rare softness in his voice. In this case, it was not deduction alone that unearthed the truth. It was the quiet persistence of a question left unanswered, and a gardener who dug one spadeful too deep. What do you think was the moment the truth began to slip from Sir Percival's control? Was it the forged will, the buried tunnel, or something far subtler? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Your theories are always a delight to read, and if you enjoyed this mystery, be sure to subscribe for more tales from Baker Street and beyond. Don't forget to share the story with fellow mystery lovers. The game, as ever, is afoot.